No, that's just intimidating. Now I have to live up to that. So opening up. At one level, it kind of seems like apple pie. Yeah, how many times do we have to talk about dialogue, engagement, discussion, conversation, opening up? Yeah, it's very well established that these are words we need to use around these kinds of discussion. But if you really listen hard, not least around the public policy underway at the moment on coronavirus, the real motivations are trust, acceptance, buy-in. Because no one knows better than the incumbent interest behind infrastructures that the best way to get people to accept what you already know they need is to have dialogue, discussion, two-way conversation in order to secure that license to operate. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very important part of the mix. So as well as that, I want to major on some other reasons why we might be interested. We as a society, we as stakeholders with very different political views might be interested in what I'm calling, and Raleigh's been calling, opening up. It goes beyond that. So how does it go beyond that? As Raleigh said, the baseline for this in infrastructures, and it's moved out into society as a whole, is evidence-based, science-based thinking. It has come out of infrastructure thinking in energy, in transport. It'll be very familiar, I think, with people here. So the gold standard for how to justify infrastructure decisions is using science-based, evidence-based methods. Here I give an example from the energy sector. This is the idea about how you might go about justifying why you're going for this infrastructure investment in transport, around car parks, around energy efficiency, whatever it may be. You look at a series of different options, you measure them on a scale of risk, or of cost-benefit analysis, or of other kinds of life cycle analysis. There's all kinds of metrics. But basically you get a picture like this. Here's one option, and you have another option, you compare them, you see which one's more or less favorable in its balance of pros and cons, and then you maybe, if you're really enlightened, you do it across a whole bunch of them. So already, there's a sense that when you're looking across a bunch of different options and involving a bunch of different criteria for doing it, you're opening up, aren't you? That's kind of one possible meaning for opening up. We're considering a bunch of different things we could do. But look at the lines. The typical way of doing this is very precise, and you get a very firm picture of which things look better and which things look worse. So I am not talking about comparison. I'm not talking about bringing in different disciplines or criteria, thinking about environment or the whole of sustainability, because all of that can be used to generate a picture like this. Opening up goes beyond that. Also, I'm not just talking about technical methods, because, and again, there's much more experience in the room here than my own with this kind of thing, but when these kinds of methods come into crisis, as they often do, when people start questioning the numbers, then in come participatory approaches, dialogue approaches, deliberative approaches, which seem to be completely different. But the typical way of applying them is exactly the same. The idea is you sit people down above a pub or in a place like this for a number of weeks, every Wednesday evening, they crunch it out in a citizens' jury or a consensus conference, and at the end you get something a bit like this. You get a clear picture of what these processes call a consensus or a verdict in a citizens' jury, fulfilling essentially the same function, taking this broad array of different infrastructure investments and performing closure, as if there's one self-evidently good option. Now, again, one can understand why that's undertaken. It's a very practical thing to do in many ways, but opening up goes beyond that for reasons I'm going to suggest. And the first reason why is because the picture you get that way is not true. Because typically, and here I'm using some of the most well-established, highest status, most mature and sophisticated examples of this kind of analysis of infrastructures. We won't bother with the details, it's in the energy sector, but that's the area where these are most rigorously practiced and get into laws. These studies all got into law in different OECD countries. The number of studies on the right-hand side, what this picture is showing you is that individual studies, individual expert groups come up with a very precise number, which appears to tell you which infrastructure investment is best. But when you look at the literature as a whole, equally science-based, equally evidence-based, you get a radical uncertainty. In fact, I have yet to see an area for the application of these techniques or for participatory techniques where rigorous process does not justify any answer you like. So by tweaking subtle features of the design of the exercise, be it analytic or participatory, one can deliberately or not justify any infrastructure choice one wants. Or leave it to chance and out pops an apparently precise answer, but it was due to some random contingency in the process. So these methods, this idea that there's one answer, is systematically misinforming society about infrastructure decisions. That somehow there is, as Mulder and Scully might have said, the answer is out there. We just have to find it. There are a whole host of reasons for this. This is not me throwing out the baby with the bathwater. These techniques remain, by techniques I mean life cycle analysis, risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis, impact assessment, decision analysis, all these tools that infrastructures use routinely to make these decisions, or consensus conferences, participatory deliberation, citizens' juries, planning cells, etc., etc. There are a host of reasons, some more relevant to analytic and quantitative, some more relevant to participatory and qualitative, how the micro detail of how you do this assessment inside the method, in the research or in the appraisal can change the answer you get. Without it being somebody being biased or somebody being stitching the method up, it's just possible for these methods to find radically different answers, equally rigorously. They're called framing assumptions, but and this needn't be so troublesome. I'm not saying, therefore, that anything goes, that we never know what's true, that there's nothing we can say about infrastructure and what would be best or what would be realistic. Just like there can be, as there often is in a meeting like this with a speaker like me in front of a microphone, an elephant in the room. There can be an elephant in the room, and yet it look radically different from different angles. In common sense parlance, just because something is true doesn't mean there's only one way to represent it. Just because a particular infrastructure may or may not be feasible, or may not be preferable or sustainable, doesn't mean there's only one way to see that. I hope that analogy fits for when we're looking at something far more indeterminate, far less familiar and prospective than an elephant. The same applies. The angle you look at it from in society, the social angle, the values, the interests, the understandings that get employed in looking at that infrastructure decision will give a different picture of what might be best. And unless society and leading stakeholders inform themselves about that, then the whole thing is vulnerable to mistakes. So it's not just about trust, it's not just about acceptance, it's not just about good process, it's about how do we actually understand what kinds of infrastructures might be feasible and might be best. So this is where I get to the sort of grand finale, such as it is. Opening up. There are a multiplicity of different choices that might be made about infrastructures. How do we at the same time address this challenge of plurality, of the fact that what looks like the right decision can vary depending on how you look at it, but also not becoming completely paralyzed by the complexity and openness of it all? And I'm going to try and say something very concrete about that. Think of the appraisal method or the research method as a box. There's an input and an output. I know this sits somewhat comically with my whole demeanor in this talk, but let's just think of that for the moment, okay? There are inputs and there are outputs. So the inputs and the outputs can be relatively narrow or broad. So by inputs, I mean the kinds of things that go into the infrastructure, research, or appraisal method. So I'm thinking about the definition of what the problem is in the first place. Is it a mobility problem? Is it a use of a particular kind of vehicle? Is it situated in a particular place? What's the nature of the problem? What are the options? What are the things we might do in order to address the actions that might be taken? Not just looking at one thing, is this good or not? Or two things, how do they compare? But an array of different ways of looking at it. Not just what are the risks or costs attached, what are the benefits as well, the wider benefits, pros and cons equally. These are all dimensions on which research or appraisal can be relatively narrow or relatively broad. The issues taken into account, are we just looking at travel time or energy in the home itself, or are we looking more broadly at air quality in the home, for instance, or sustainability issues more generally around transport? How wide do we put that net? Uncertainties. Do we treat everything as a risk to hit with a probability hammer, Or are we, as is being forced upon the government at the moment with the COVID-19, thinking beyond risk to uncertainty? And perspectives, this crucial issue that Rally really outlined. Who's doing all this? As I showed in the earlier chart, even if you just bring a bunch of experts on a committee, you can get completely different views, let alone bringing in wider stakeholders. So these are ways in which the method can be relatively narrow or broad. And this is the conventional way that people think when we say opening up. This is what we mean. And we do mean that, but not just this. It's not just what goes into the method. It's also what comes out. So there's the other angle. How the method speaks to its clients, its supporters, wider political debates. What does the method say at the other end? Does it, as is normal in infrastructure decisions, say, we've looked at this really hard, here's our report, it's 2 feet thick, there's a pink summary of like half a page for the policymaker, and it says do X. Is that how it communicates to wider political decisions? Or does it say, well, we've looked at the issues very hard, we've looked at it on different perspectives, we've broadened it out in all the ways I just summarized, and as a result, we can tell you a whole bunch of things just don't look like they cut it. But there are a number that could. If you assume A, if you take view A or perspective A, then X looks best. If you take perspective B, Y looks best. So it's plural, it's conditional. You're not saying, not cranking out like a justification machine one answer, you're systematically exploring how different answers depend on different assumptions, perspectives. And that's absolutely what's not happening, for instance, on COVID-19 at the moment, where the British are so confident in this language of science-based decisions, so we're hearing on the radio daily, distinctive actually from other countries, that the fact that necessarily the measures being implemented in this country on this pandemic are involving a balance between the economic impacts and the public health impacts and a whole host of other things. So what's the science-based balance that's being struck there? What science tells you how important lives of particular people are compared to the economy? There is no science of that. The science is really crucial in informing about particular bodies of evidence, but it can't tell you definitively what that balance should be, and yet that's what underlies the British government's position. So there's an example of how there's a pretense that science-based, evidence-based definitiveness as a political tool to justify decisions. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that language is misleading. So this avoids that. This avoids what can be the adverse consequences of insisting there's only one answer when actually there patently is not. So finally then, let's look at what some of the methods are to look at that. And so as I hope I've tried to, at least I've tried to make clear, this framework for thinking about broadening out and opening up, broadening out the inputs, opening up the outputs, is a way to think about any kind of research method, not just analytic or deliberative or dialogue, all of them together can be thought about in this way. And the devil depends on the details. So all kinds of conventional methods actually occupy a space. Here's decision analysis. You can do it like cost-benefit in the top left, pretending at a firm answer. You can acknowledge the uncertainties, which is very rare, in the middle, or down at the bottom using a tool like multi-criteria mapping that we've developed in Sussex. But there's many others like this. You can actually unpick systematically under different perspectives what infrastructure decisions look better or worse with the uncertainties in them. You see those 4 charts. They've all got uncertainty, but they're also separating out the ambiguities between perspectives, the different views on the elephant. And you just can say, under this view you get X, under that view you get Y, and talk about it in the way Raleigh was saying. But not with a view to closing it all down, opening up a discussion about how the actual what looks best or worst is varied. So that's what I'm talking about, practical choices between methods. Same is true of participatory approaches. So, as an enthusiast like me will love to get into, there are hundreds of methods that one can use. But one can think about any of them. It's not like some methods are good, some methods are bad. One can think about them in this kind of way because the devil is in the detail. How you practice that method. Are you actually allowing it to consider a range of different inputs, and are you actually communicating it in the way I've suggested? But what's of particular interest here, because some people will say back to me in the face of this kind of discussion, well, Andy, yeah, it's all very well opening up, and an academic can say that, but in the real world we need to close down, we need to make decisions. Of course. But just because you need to make a decision doesn't mean that you need to pretend. Because action is needed doesn't mean knowledge has to be closed down. It's perfectly normal in a democracy to understand, yes, governments make decisions, people may disagree with it, let's inform ourselves about what these disagreements are. That doesn't stop you making a decision. It can actually make the decision more robust. And, of course, there's a limit to this. But what we're doing here is undertaking these approaches not on a flat, level playing field, but in a steep gradient where there are strong pressures on researchers, on decision makers at every level to close down. So you have a gradient where these kinds of techniques at the top left constantly being favoured. I'm not saying they're invalid. There are times and places when they're good to close down. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm just saying there are so many pressures to do it that way that we need to deliberately put a little bit of emphasis, like Raleig's project is, behind projects on the lower and the right-hand side. We need to really emphasize them, otherwise they won't happen. So going from a kind of controlling view to a more caring, attentive, mutualistic, some of the values that Raleigh highlighted. There are some particular techniques that are of interest. There's a STEP Centre, a Sussex-based research centre. We've got a methods website. We've got a whole bunch of vignettes, a couple of pages on each of these methods about how they can be used. There's no one right answer, but they all show you different ways in which one can open out in a very practical way. And just to make the point in the end, that rather than denying the politics in infrastructure decisions, this is a way of embracing that. These decisions are political. Some of the most important developments and transformations, positive transformations in infrastructures, and people here will know better than me, have been due to political culture change, making things possible, as is happening now on climate. So it's not a question of denying politics, it's a question of working with it, nurturing it, to use Raleigh's words, going with that flow, and recognizing in the end, no amount of analysis can give you a single definitive view. What you're doing is opening up a space in which society as a whole can be more democratic and more robust. And if that happens, then infrastructure decisions can actually also work better in narrow ways for the different stakeholders involved. So that's my quick pitch at what opening up might mean and how it might work. I hope it's made some kind of sense. Thanks. Thanks, Andy.